Hello everybody and welcome back to Big Johnny D History. Today we are resuming our look at Epic History series on Napoleon, continuing his Italian campaign. The last time we left off, Napoleon delivered a dominating victory over the Austrians at Bassano, taking over 6 times the casualties against the Austrians than he took. At the very end of the video, they tease that now, since Wurmser is now locked in the siege of Mantua after Napoleon's victory at Bassano, that Joseph Alvinci will now be leading the force to fight Napoleon in the Italian campaign. And at the very end of the video, they tease that Alvinci would become the first man to defeat Napoleon. And I'm extremely curious to see how we go from such a high at Bassano with those casualty numbers to Napoleon apparently having some struggles here. The reason I paused it here because this is the same intro that Epic History shows at the beginning of each of the Italian campaign videos. I paused it right here at the end because their closing image of the intro is a photo of Napoleon leading a charge across the bridge of Arcole. I do know that that charge failed, but it absolutely cemented Napoleon and boosted Napoleonic legend. For a general like Napoleon to do this at the bridge of Arcole is unheard of in modern warfare, and even at the time period that it was unusual for a commander of an army to put himself at risk like this. This absolutely cemented Napoleon's legend, not only to his troops, but to people like me and you that are watching Napoleon's escapades today and just being absolutely enamored with the man. But anyway, that's enough talking. Let's get into the video. This is Napoleon at Arcole by Epic History.
October 1796. 6 months have passed since General Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the French army of Italy. In that time, he's led a series of brilliant operations against the Austrians and won a string of battles. Now he appears close to final victory. He's driven Austrian field forces off the plains of northern Italy, back towards the Alps, while his troops have the great fortress city of Mantua, the key to Italy, under close siege. Mantua's oversized Austrian garrison is nearing starvation and riddled with disease.
Disease is something that has affected warfare more than most people give it credit for. If you look back at any war before World War II, most casualties were to sickness and disease rather than direct combat. As unbelievable as that can sound with wars like World War I and the American Civil War and the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of casualties, I'm not sure if it was a majority exactly, but a high percentage of casualties were due to sickness. But this, taking half of your casualties as sickness in Mantua, that is absolutely devastating. Napoleon wrote a letter to the Directory at some point, calling it the most unhealthy place in Europe. And these numbers from the Austrians here absolutely demonstrate that.
Napoleon appeals to its commander, Field Marshal von Wurmser, to surrender. The brave should be facing danger, not swamp plague, he jibes. But Wurmser is a tough old veteran. He will not yield while any glimmer of hope remains. And he knows that to the north, Austria is gathering fresh troops to march to his aid. True, many are Grentz battalions, a type of Habsburg frontier militia, poorly drilled and short of officers, but they help raise the strength of the Austrian field army to 44,000.
Wow, so even not including the garrison in Mantua, Napoleon is still outnumbered. And they mentioned this in the last video, that Napoleon requested 25,000 reinforcements and only received 3,000. So just over a tenth of the reinforcements that he requested, he actually received. And that's a big part of the wider picture here is that France doesn't really see this front as the most important front. They don't even see it as the second most important front or the second most important army, with Monroe and Jourdan's army getting priority over Napoleon's. Despite that, you still see Napoleon stringing up this series of victories, which makes it all the more impressive. In my opinion, what makes it one, if not his most impressive campaign, because it wasn't like later in his career when he was emperor and had control over where troops were going in force.
They have a new general to lead them. Feldzeugmeister, or Lieutenant General, Józef Alvinci. The 61-year-old Hungarian was once military tutor to Emperor Francis himself, and is regarded as diligent, sharp, and brave. He and his staff draw up plans for a fresh offensive to rescue Wurmser and Mantua. Alvinci and Kostanovic will lead the main column, 26,000 strong, from Friuli to Bassano, then onwards to Mantua. Davidovic's corps, reinforced to 18,000, will retake Trento and push south through the Adige Valley. The two forces will link up at the earliest opportunity. Meanwhile, Wurmser, who can muster just 12,000 fit men from the Mantua garrison, will launch powerful sorties to pin down as many French units as possible. Napoleon, by contrast, has received very few reinforcements from France. His weary divisions are suffering from shortages and sickness, and will be outnumbered on every front. Alvinci begins his advance on the 22nd of October. The following day, the heavens open, drenching troops, swelling rivers, and reducing roads to mud.
The significance of weather in warfare, especially in these olden, before modern warfare, cannot be understated at all. Because think about it, meteorologists get the weather wrong today. Sometimes you might want to go swimming and they're going to predict that it's going to be bright and sunny out and a ton of rain's going to come and ruin your day. But back then, there was almost no level of weather prediction. You could barely predict the weather from day to day. So if it rained, and the most notable example of this that I can think of talking about Napoleon is Waterloo. If it hadn't rained the previous night and Napoleon didn't need to wait for the ground to dry, maybe Napoleon beats Wellington at Waterloo. So the weather can absolutely decide the outcome of a war, a campaign, a battle, anything. And that's what you might be seeing here with Alvinci getting slowed down by this rain.
Time being, Napoleon is content to observe the enemy struggle forward in such conditions, knowing the effort will exhaust his infantry and disrupt supplies. On the 2nd of November, fighting breaks out north of Trento, where Napoleon has ordered Vaubois to attack. He wants to keep Davidovich bottled up, but Vaubois is heavily outnumbered, and his attack fails. Vaubois begins pulling back to Caliano, while Massena gives up Bassano and withdraws towards Vicenza. But now Alvinci's advance becomes strung out, slowed by the heavy rain and poor fitness of his recruits. And it is against Napoleon's nature to remain passive for so long. As the Austrians cross the Brenta, he orders Massena to attack General Liptay's division at Fontaniva, while Augereau attacks Hohenzollern at Bassano. The French launched dozens of separate assaults. But for all their poor march discipline, the Austrian recruits stand their ground and fight hard. With around 3,000 casualties on each side, the Second Battle of Bassano is the bloodiest day's fighting so far in the Italian campaign.
Bloodiest day fighting, ultimately resulting in a stalemate for the consequences of the campaign as well as the casualties.
And a failure for Napoleon. Hours later, he receives dire news from Vaubois. During heavy fighting at Castiglione, some Croatian troops get behind the French line, triggering panic and a rout. Vaubois loses nearly half his division, killed, wounded, or missing, before he can regroup at Rivoli. The French are falling back on all fronts, and unless Napoleon can conjure something remarkable, he seems destined to suffer a major strategic defeat.
I absolutely love that epic history includes these quotes, because Napoleon has some of the best quotes in all of history from any man. So Napoleon's proclamation to the 39th and 85th Demi Brigades: "Soldiers, I am not satisfied with you. You abandoned yourself to panic. You were driven from positions where a handful of brave men might have stopped an army. Let it be inscribed on their colors. They are no longer a part of the army of Italy." What a powerful quote from Napoleon, because he expects nothing but the best from his men. He's saying that if there's any sort of cowardice here, if you don't absolutely push yourself to your limit and achieve excellence, then you might as well not be a part of this army. And it's words like this that are extremely inspiring to the men and motivate them to push forward and way beyond what an average unit would be capable of.
Napoleon's position is perilous, but his enemy's cautious pursuit affords him some respite. 4 whole days pass while Alvinci and Davidovich coordinate their next moves. It's not a delay Napoleon would have tolerated if the shoe had been on the other foot. When the Austrians finally advance, it's bungled. Hohenzollern's vanguard approaches Verona to investigate reports of a French retreat. This isolated division is too tempting for Napoleon to ignore. He orders Augereau and Massena to attack. They inflict 400 casualties, but Hohenzollern escapes to a ridge near Caldiero. The next day, Napoleon orders renewed attacks. But conditions are atrocious. The French struggle uphill into driving rain and hail, their boots slipping in the mud, under fire from Austrians dug in on the ridgetop. Around noon, Colonel Dupuy's 32nd Demi Brigade finally gets onto the ridge. It looks like the French...
I don't know if that's going through for your guys, but my audio got a lot quieter, so I apologize if this for cutting off the instance of battle here. We'll go back a couple seconds, but it was for whatever reason the volume just shot down.
His 32nd Demi Brigade finally gets onto the ridge. It looks like the French may be able to lever the Austrians out of their position. But then, the Austrian army begins to arrive in force to support Hohenzollern's hard-pressed division.
This is another situation of the weather majorly affecting the battle, because had Napoleon had clean weather, not the rain, he probably would have been able to defeat this isolated Austrian division before the rest of the army showed up. But since the weather was the way it was and Napoleon's men couldn't advance up the ridge as quickly, well, now here are the Austrians.
Danger of being outflanked on both wings. They take up new defensive positions and hold the line until darkness, when Napoleon cuts his losses and orders a retreat to Verona. It has been an unequivocal French defeat, Napoleon's first in battle.
So this is Napoleon's first defeat in battle, was to the Austrians. It was The weather, Napoleon, due to the weather, made a miscalculation in trying to attack that isolated division. Seemed easy on paper, but the weather wasn't having it, and resilient defense from the Austrian troops to hold out against Napoleon's men, because that division was outnumbered. So to hold out until the rest of the Austrians got there, they accomplished everything that they needed to do.
The following day, he writes furiously to the Directory in Paris. He has no doubt that they are to blame for his defeat, for repeatedly failing to send reinforcements. We may be on the verge of losing Italy. None of the expected help has arrived. The army of Italy, reduced to a handful of men, is worn out. The heroes of Lodi, Millesimo, Castiglione and Bassano have died for their country or are in the hospitals. The men have nothing left but their reputation and their pride.
And this would be part of the reason that Napoleon would go on to despise the Directory. Following or preceding the coup, he referred to them as a government of lawyers, basically saying that they knew nothing about the field of battle. And you could see the seeds being sown here for Napoleon's eventual coup, because ultimately he might be right by blaming the Directory. If Napoleon had the 25,000 men that he required as opposed to the 3,000 that he got, well, he wouldn't have been outnumbered on likely any of those fronts. He was outnumbered against Davidovich. He was outnumbered against Alvinci. He's outnumbered in the siege of Mantua itself, less men guarding it that are than that are inside Mantua. Jesus, tripping over my words. But yeah, it's a fair assumption to blame the Directory.
Are abandoned in the depths of Italy. But despite his apparent despair, Napoleon has already devised a plan to strike back. A breathtakingly bold move that will spawn one of the greatest of Napoleonic legends.
Napoleon to the Directory, another fantastic quote right here. In a few days, we will try one last effort. If fortune smiles upon us, Mantua will be taken, and with it, Italy, because Mantua was the key to Italy. That's key to remember here. The whole reason that Alvinci is coming back in the first place and he's fighting Napoleon here is to free up Mantua, because without that fortress, it disturbs the balance of Austrian defense in Italy.
With the Austrians converging on Verona, Napoleon decides to risk everything on a daring surprise attack. Leaving Macquart to cover Verona, he will circle south with the rest of the army, cross the Adige River, and swing north, threatening to cut Alvinci's lines of communication and capture his artillery, baggage, and supplies. Such losses will force Alvinci to abandon his advance. Marching overnight, Augereau and Massena arrive undetected at Ronco. Augereau's men cross the Adige on a pontoon bridge and begin moving north. But with marshland on all sides, they have to stick to the narrow, raised causeway, just 20 yards wide. And when they reach Arcole, where they must cross the bridge to continue north, they find it held by 2 Croatian battalions. Horribly exposed on the causeway, and under heavy fire, the French troops take cover behind its reverse slope. Reinforcements are sent up, but they too are pinned down by the weight of fire from the far bank. Colonel Lannes had discharged himself from hospital that morning in order not to miss the battle. He now attempts to lead a charge, but is hit in the leg. The fiery Augereau.
Marshal Lannes is one of Napoleon's most badass marshals, possibly the most badass marshal that there is. Maybe him and Murat contending there for that title. Because he was wounded before, came back to battle, just because he didn't want to see the battle go without him, gets wounded again at the battle. This is the type of like masculinity that is admirable in the Napoleonic era. This is the braveness, the courageness that makes this area of history so easy to fall in love with.
Refuses to accept defeat and orders another attack. But his men are exhausted and demoralized, with 3 generals wounded. The attack at Arcole has stalled. When Alvinci hears gunfire from the south, he assumes the French are making a feint to divert him from his own planned attack on Verona. But then comes alarming news that the French have crossed the Adige in force and are behind his left flank. He sends 2 brigades to attack the French bridgehead and diverts Mitrovsky to reinforce Arcole. Massena's division, moving northwest to protect the flank of the advance, runs straight into the Austrians at Bionde. At first, the Austrians have the better of it. But a disastrous friendly fire incident triggers panic, and Massena drives the Austrians back up the causeway. Napoleon is increasingly concerned by the hold-up at Arcole. If they cannot break through, Alvinci will have ample time to redeploy and prevent any advance. He now orders General Gueux to take 2 regiments, cross the Adige at Albaredo, and lead them up the eastern bank of the Alpone River to hit Arcole from the south. He himself rides to the bridge to try to get the attack moving. He finds hundreds of French troops sheltering behind the causeway, unwilling to face the Austrian fire. General Augereau grabs a standard and begins to advance. This highly romanticized depiction was painted 2 years later. "Grenadiers," he cries, "come and seek your color." In reality, none had the courage to follow him.
You can say what you will about Augereau, but the guy was incredibly courageous. There's a lot with Augereau with looting, and I think that was one of his major cons and ultimately what prevented him from being one of the like really top tier of the Napoleonic era. He's still fantastic, but what prevents him from being on a level of a Marshal Lannes or a Suchet is his looting habits. But here he was absolutely courageous, and you could tell he was seeking glory. He really wanted to distinguish himself here, because this, to grab a standard and try to lead a charge, exposing yourself to fire, it's extremely risky.
Then, the commander of the Army of Italy himself draws his saber, picks up a standard, and runs forward. There is withering fire all around. Several men fall wounded. His aide-de-camp, Colonel Murat, is killed. Another aide-de-camp, a Polish officer named Sulkowski, recalls, "The soldiers saw him, and none of them imitated him. I was witness to this extraordinary cowardice, and I cannot conceive it."
And the charge across the bridge, Napoleon tried to do it. Same thing I said with Augereau, absolutely courageous. For Napoleon to be the commander of the army, to try to grab a standard and lead the charge across the bridge, astonishing. Astonishing. You would barely ever hear of somebody like that in history ever, which is why Napoleon ranks so highly in terms of history as he does. But just because the charge here across the bridge didn't work, in that quote, they say the soldiers saw him, and they did. And not all of Napoleon's army is here in this moment. But the idea of hearing of your commander trying to do this in such an amazing act of bravery, that spreads morale throughout your army, as well as solidifies your legend to them in a way that a lot of other generals didn't have respect for their soldiers didn't have respect for the generals. All the soldiers absolutely respected Napoleon, and it was because of actions like this.
With the French infantry refusing to follow their officers, the assault on the bridge ends in abject failure. A well-timed Austrian counterattack drives them back down the causeway. In the rout, Napoleon's horse loses its footing. He tumbles into the swamp and has to be hauled out by his aides. That evening, General Gueux launches his attack on Arcole from the south. The defenses are less formidable on this side, and his men fight their way into the village.
See, this attack here is a lot more likely to be successful because if you look at the geography of where the bridge is, the one road leading up to it that's just completely exposed to fire across this narrow causeway, it was a long shot for Napoleon to succeed here at Arcole.
Arcole, at last, has fallen. But that night, Gueux's men are ordered to pull back. Napoleon is preparing to retreat. If, as he expects, Davidovich has continued his advance down the Adige Valley, Napoleon must withdraw now or face encirclement. His bold maneuver appears to have failed. Then, at 4 a.m., Napoleon receives a report from Rivoli that changes everything. Not only does Vaubois still hold the town, he hasn't even been attacked yet. Napoleon's line of retreat remains secure for at least a few days more. It's all the reassurance he needs. He immediately cancels his retreat and issues orders to attack.
Oh, I didn't know that Arcole was a multi-day battle. This is a big one.
Napoleon has lost the element of surprise, and Alvinci is now planning his own counterattack. Overnight, his troops edge forward. Provera to Belfiore di Porcile, Mitrovsky back into Arcole. Both armies are on the move before dawn. Massena sends skirmishers into the marshland. When the Austrians arrive, bunched up on the causeway, they make easy targets. After a sharp fight in which an Austrian general is killed, Massena's men are driving the enemy before them.
Another amazing display from Massena. And it really does go to show, I do think that he was Napoleon's best general in Italy. He was Napoleon's best officer by far. The fact that it's small things that don't seem that innovative on paper, but to put troops in the marshland, to have 2 lanes of fire barraging the Austrians, resulting in one of their generals being taken out, amazing.
Augereau, however, cannot get close to Arcole. The causeway is still swept by Austrian musket fire and canister from across the Alponi. Napoleon orders troops to cross downstream at Albaredo, but the Austrians now have 2 battalions guarding the crossing point. French attempts to float or swim across the river come to naught. Day 2 of the battle ends in stalemate. Many soldiers have to camp amid the marshes and get what food and rest they can. Napoleon will try once more to break through, but he is running out of time.
Wow.
Davidovich, who by now has received several urgent requests from Alvinci to advance, finally attacks on the 17th of November.
Davidovich seems like more of a cautious commander. You know, he didn't want to do the attack unless he was absolutely sure of the situation. Because had Davidovich just attacked at the same time Alvinci made his advance and continued with the plan that they said the Austrians had, Napoleon wouldn't have a chance to do a 3-day battle at Arcole. He simply wouldn't. He wouldn't be able to risk it based on the possibility of encirclement. So the fact that Davidovich was a little bit cautious proceeding down the Brenta Valley definitely played into the fact that Napoleon was able to recover this situation.
Vaubois' outgunned division breaks. The Austrians take Rivoli and 1,000 prisoners and nearly capture Vaubois himself. With Davidovich on the move at last, Napoleon must force a decision at Arcole or retreat. The bridge at Arcole has proved too tough to crack. So Napoleon switches tactics. Augereau's division will cross the Alpone and attack Arcole from the south in force. A column is sent 10 miles south to cross at Legnago and then race back up the eastern bank to support him. Massena will advance up the causeway in support, while also protecting the left flank. That night, the French assemble a pontoon bridge over the Alpone. Augereau's division begins crossing before dawn. But at sunrise, Austrian gunners in Albaredo spot the bridge and score a hit, knocking it out of action. Only the 51st Demi Brigade is across, though it gamely begins to advance on Arcole. Massena's advance is also hamstrung by a broken pontoon bridge. To add to the crisis, the Austrians launch an attack on the fragile French bridgehead. Napoleon gathers every available gun to blast the Austrians, who fall back under a withering barrage. The bridges are quickly repaired. But as the French advance, they encounter stubborn opposition on both sides of the Alpone. A bloody seesaw battle surges back and forth along the causeways. Neither side can deploy its troops nor gain an advantage.
What an incredible display that must have been. Like, I know we're seeing it with the painting, but can you imagine being in a battle? Let's say you're one of the French or Austrian troops and you're fighting on the side of this narrow causeway and you're in this, what they said, a seesaw battle, back and forth, back and forth. And on the other side of the causeway, you're watching another battle where pop shots can be taken from either side of the causeway at each other. This is something that you would see in a movie. Like, this is incredible.
Around 3 p.m., the French column from Legnago arrives, threatening to turn the Austrian flank. Just as Arcole seems about to fall, the Austrians launch a ferocious counterattack across the bridge. Brigadier General Robert is killed. His troops fall back in disarray. The panic is contagious. Augereau's men lose their nerve and fall back to the bridge. The moment of crisis has arrived. But while the enemy has just used his last reserves, Napoleon can call on Massena's unengaged troops, including the elite 32nd Demi Brigade. Their sudden counterattack turns the tide. Massena's men sweep up the causeway, taking scores of prisoners, as Augereau's division resumes its advance. As they approach Arcole, Napoleon arranges a small ruse de guerre. 25 of his elite escort sweep in from the east, blowing bugles to feign a mass cavalry charge. In the evening light, it's enough to scare the remaining garrison into abandoning the village.
That's incredible. That's another phenomenal bluff by Napoleon. We see him do something similar earlier in the campaign, but that might be even more impressive. To have a small sortie of 25 men come up blowing bugles just to, not have anything there to feign a cavalry charge, to fool the Austrians that way, that is incredibly innovative and devious.
As the French continue their advance, Alvinci orders his exhausted, demoralized army to retreat east, to Montebello, to protect its lines of communication. The three-day Battle of Arcole has been a messy, bloody affair, with no great tactical flourishes. Napoleon's margin of victory is narrow, and a third of his army are casualties. But he has done enough, for now.
Wow. It took good luck to defeat Alvinci. That is a major compliment from Napoleon on Alvinci's leadership skills. And it did take a degree of luck. It took a degree of luck and also Napoleon's own savviness. That was a very brutal battle. 10,000 casualties, a winner that is, only really Napoleon by definition. Both armies suffered greatly during that battle.
Alvinci may be withdrawing, but Davidovich remains a threat. The next day, Napoleon sets off at his customary pace with Massena's division to reinforce Vaubois. Augereau takes a different route to threaten the Austrians' line of retreat. The confusion that follows between Alvinci and Davidovich verges on farce. Alvinci writes to his corps commander, informing him that he will support him by resuming his advance. But Davidovich, having heard of the defeat at Arcole and now directly menaced by Napoleon, is already retreating. On receiving Alvinci's letter, however, he tries to turn his army around, leading to such chaos that he has to immediately countermand that order and resume his retreat. The end result is that both Austrian armies are soon withdrawing. And with exquisitely poor timing, gallant old Wurmser chooses this moment to launch his supporting attack from Mantua.
And you got to think, Wurmser had no way to communicate with the Austrian army at this point. They are in deadlock siege. Nothing is coming in and out of Mantua, unless the French say it's okay. So Wurmser, unfortunately, just didn't choose the right time to try to launch it.
Does at least secure some much-needed supplies, at a cost of 800 casualties. It has been a bruising campaign for Napoleon. By some estimates, he has lost more men than the Austrians. He has suffered his first defeat in battle, and won a costly, messy victory at Arcole. But he has beaten the odds and thrown back the enemy. What's more, his heroic conduct at the bridge at Arcole will soon take on a life of its own. Artists and pamphleteers turn a slightly embellished version of events into a sensational piece of personal PR that captivates France.
You could see Napoleon's name was still spelt Bonaparte at that point.
Napoleon's active encouragement, the world is witnessing the birth of the Napoleonic legend. A powerful force that will inspire loyalty and devotion for many years to come. For now, both armies settle into winter quarters, as December brings bitter cold and heavy snow to northern Italy. In Mantua, the Austrian garrison is near its limit. Starvation beckons, though Wurmser is determined to hold out to the last. The Austrians will have one last chance to save the city. A final offensive to decide the outcome of the war in Italy. A big thank you to
That was absolutely phenomenal. Major props to Epic History and PMF Productions for a phenomenal video here with their video on Arcole. I highly recommend that you check out Epic History's channel. I will have their channel linked in the description. Check it out. If you guys haven't seen any of my previous videos on this Napoleonic series, they will be in a playlist that will also be linked in the description below, or you can just go to the channel to find it. If you guys have anything to say in the comments below, challenge the stuff that I said. Let me know if you learned anything from Epic History or the stuff that I added on. I know I learned a lot, as I always do when I watch these videos. It was absolutely phenomenal. And the one main takeaway that I got from today's video was that Davidovich might have been the cause of Napoleon winning in Italy. His cautious advance, not advancing at the speed Alvinci did, waiting those extra 3 days, and then hastily rushing to the order to retreat, panicking after hearing about Arcole, and then trying to counteract that, come back. Well, nope, it's too late. People are already retreating. There's a level of panic here. It seems that Davidovich was too cautious for its own good. When you're fighting Napoleon, you do want to be cautious to a certain degree. When Napoleon is menacing you across the battlefield, it's not exactly the most encouraging sight given his track record, but you can't be so cautious and indecisive as to cripple your army, because if Alvinci continued his advance, even after losing at Arcole in a narrow battle, and Davidovich remained where he was or got into battle with Napoleon, there likely could have been an encirclement, and thus Mantua would have been freed. Maybe Napoleon would have been able to pull something else out, because at this stage in his career, he is a major innovator and has some of the smartest ideas that have ever been seen in warfare. But you never know. Maybe the Austrians come out victorious if not for Davidovich's inaction at that moment. But anyway, excuse me. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Leave a comment below if you did. Hit like and subscribe if you did. I would love for you all to join me on this journey, as we will be discussing a lot of Napoleon and eventually some other historical topics as well. I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.